வாங்க இன்றைக்கி நான் இன்ட்ரெஸ்டிங்கான ஒரு வீடியோ காட்ட போகிறேன். ஸோ அமெரிக்காவில் கண்டுபிடிச்சிருக்காங்க மேம்மோத். இது வந்து அனிமல், என்ன வெரைட்டி ஆஃப் அனிமல்னால் எலிஃபெண்ட்டோட வெரைட்டி தான் வரும். ஸோ நாங்கள் இப்போ அங்கே தான் வந்திருக்கோம். உங்களுக்கு போன்ஸு, அதை கண்டுபிடிச்ச ஸ்டோன்ஸு, ஸோ போன்ஸ் ஸ்டோன்ஸ் எல்லாம் உங்களுக்கு காட்டுறேன். வாங்க பார்க்கலாம். ஸோ ஸ்கிப் பண்ணாமல் பாருங்கள், வீடியோ இன்ட்ரெஸ்டிங்காக இருக்கும்.
பே பண்ணணும்னு சொல்லியிருக்காங்களாம், அதனால தான் பே பண்ணுமாண்டா, அந்த மாதிரி பே இல்ல.
ஸோ ஃப்ரண்ட்டில் எல்லா இடத்துலையுமே ஒரு ஸ்டோர் இருக்கும். இப்போ டேலஸ் ஜூ போனீங்கன்னா அந்த ஜூவோட ரிலேட்டடான திங்ஸ் எல்லாம் விற்பாங்க, அனிமல்ஸ் அந்த மாதிரி. அதே மாதிரி இப்போ மேம்மோத்தோட ஸ்டோரில் என்னென்ன இருக்குன்னா போன்ஸ், அதோட ஸ்டோன்ஸ், அங்கே கண்டுபிடிக்கும் போது என்னென்ன கிடைச்சதோ அதெல்லாம் விற்றுட்டு இருந்தாங்க. அங்கேயும் போன்ஸ்லாம் வச்சு பண்ணிகிட்டு இருந்தாங்க. இங்கே டிக்கெட் கவுண்டர். ஸோ இப்போ வீடியோக்குள்ளே போகலாம் வாங்க. அவங்க ரொம்ப அழகாக எக்ஸ்பிளைன் பண்ணிகிட்டு இருந்தாங்க. எப்படின்னா ஒரு லேடி வந்து ஃபுல்லுமே என்னென்ன நடந்தது, நாங்கள் எப்படியெல்லாம் கண்டுபிடிக்கிறோம் அதெல்லாம் சொல்லிட்டு இருந்தாங்க. அவங்க ஒரே ஆள் தான் இருக்காங்க இதை கண்டுபிடிக்கிறதுக்கு. ஸோ உங்களுக்கு யாராவது தெரிஞ்சால் நீங்களும் வந்து ஜாயின் பண்ணிக்கலாம் இந்த ஃபீல்டில். ஸோ இதான் ரியலான போன்ஸ், அதோடது எல்லாம் கண்டுபிடிச்சிட்ருக்காங்க. இன்னும் நிறைய கண்டுபிடிப்பாங்க. நீங்கள் பாருங்கள், அவங்க எக்ஸ்பிளைன் பண்ணுவாங்க. ஃபுல் வீடியோ பாருங்கள், உங்களுக்கு அவங்க ஃபுல்லாக எக்ஸ்பிளைன் பண்ணுவாங்க. உங்களுக்கு ரொம்ப நல்லாயிருக்கும், பிடிக்கும். நீங்கள் போய் பாருங்கள், இன்னும் இன்ட்ரெஸ்டிங்காக இருக்கும். ஸோ இப்போ வந்து எக்ஸ்பிளைன் பண்ணுவாங்க. இவங்க எக்ஸ்பிளைன் பண்ணுறது ஃபுல்லுமே டீட்டெயில்டாக இருக்கும்.
It stands at 13.5 feet tall, which is shorter than the average. The average height would be 14 feet in the air. The reason our mammoths are so tall is because, as the saying goes, everything is bigger in pictures, right? Now give me 1 second, folks. Hi there, folks. Outside, I need to get my phone in, make sure it's secure. No flash music. So we've got our Columbian mammoths here, but what happened to them? How did we find them here? Well, that first bone that was found here was actually found on accident, and it was found in 1978 by 2 teenage boys. Any food or drinks outside, anything that might pull in, so it's secure and no flash. Now it was found originally in the creek bed right outside. And it was found by 2 teenage boys just wandering through the property. This wasn't even their property. As they were wandering through, one of the bones poking out from the ground looked a lot like a human skull. So they decided right then and there to dig that bone out. And when they got it out, they realized it did not belong to a human, but they weren't sure what kind of animal it belonged to. So they took it to Baylor University, which had a natural history museum that we now know as the Baylor Museum on campus. And it was at that museum where that bone was identified as belonging to a Columbian mammoth. Now, in 1980, Baylor University came out with permission from the landowner and began excavating in the creek that each of us had to walk over to get into this building. That is what we know as phase 1 of our excavation. It lasted 10 years, and we found 16 Columbian mammoths. Out of those 16, there were 3 juveniles and 13 adult females. There was not one single adult male, which meant that we had found a nursery herd of Columbian mammoths, the first ever nursery herd to be discovered. So this is a very important discovery. We wanted to protect those bones. Everything that might fall in, make sure it's secure and no flash. So we wrapped those bones in plaster jackets and we sent them back to the Baylor Museum where they're still held today. No flash mirrors, any photos, and secure anything that might fall in. And we thought that was it. 16 mammoths is a lot of mammoths. So we thought we were all done and we sent them back. But as we were filling in those holes, we actually hit something right over here in our bone bed. And as you can see, there are quite a few bones over here. So that bone actually sparked our second phase of excavations, which we are still in today. So we are still considered an active dig site today. Now this does not mean that we are always actively digging, but it does mean that anything in search of our site. But why was the nursery herd here? What happened to them? Well, for that we're going to want to look at the bones. So if we can all file in and go to our railing over there so we can all see our bone bed and look at our bones today. That's why we had to cross over that bridge. But if you look at this indented pathway right here, that is the original creek bed that would have flowed through the property 65,000 years ago. And you can see just how close our mammoths are sticking to that water source. So that's why they were walking through, but what happened to them? Well, we have two hypotheses on how these animals may have passed away. The first revolves around the soil. When we look back at this dirt wall right about here, there is a darker layer of soil. That darker layer indicates a flooding event. Now we're not near the ocean, we're not near a coast. A flooding event this far inland would have been a flash flood, which does not get a lot of warning. So, because our mammoths are sticking so close to that creek bed, the flash flood sweeps through, they don't have enough time to escape, and our first hypothesis is that this flash flood that covered our bones also killed our herd. That is what is being depicted in this mural right over here to my left. We have our nursery herd walking through that creek bed with the flash flood sweeping through. But just because we see a flood in the fossil record does not mean that that is what killed our herd. It's entirely possible the herd had already passed away. So we had to start looking at the bones, which is going to bring us right over here to Mammoth S. And Mammoth S's sign is actually incorrect. Now, we did not get a full-time paleontologist on staff until 2020, but we have been digging since 1980. So, one of her first things she focused on was making sure all the signs were accurate. Now, we're in the process of updating Mammoth S's sign, but this word right here is wrong. Mammoth S is not a juvenile. She is a fully grown adult, and we know that because the growth plates in her legs have fused together. Your growth plates are what allow you to have growth spurts. You stop growing once they have fully fused. Because Mammoth S down here has fully fused growth plates, we know she would not have gotten larger than she is right now. So then why is she so small? Well, there are a couple of reasons that may be. Hi there, folks. Any food or water can stay dry after any food that might fall in, and then no plastic. From malnourishment. Both of those will have other symptoms that will show up on the skeleton. And when we look at the skeleton of Mammoth S, we see along the surface of her bones, those pits tell us is that towards the end of her life, Mammoth S was so hungry, she began to reabsorb minerals from her skeletal system in order to stay alive. This is going to point towards that malnutrition. And this is what our second hypothesis is, that this malnutrition and hunger is what led to the death of the herd. Because remember, these mammoths are in the middle of a drought. So all of that food they're relying on, which is just grass, they only ate grass. And they had to eat over 400 pounds of grass per mammoth per day. All of that food is starting to die or has already died. And this might be why they're sticking so close to that creek bed. Not only would it have been a water source, but any food that they did need would be growing next to that water. Now, we don't just have this bottom layer of soil. If we look right up here, there's another mammoth on this higher layer of soil. This is Mammoth Q up here, and he's not from that nursery herd layer. If you look at the dirt, you might see it's a good 2 to 3 feet above that bottom layer. This means that Mammoth Q died after our nursery herd had already been buried, meaning that Mammoth Q is younger than 65,000 years old. But how much younger? Well, when we look back at our beautiful dirt wall, we're going to see a darker layer of soil right about here. That darker layer of soil is 51,000 years old. Mammoth Q sits below that layer. This is going to get us a time frame for Mammoth Q. He is younger than 65,000 and older than 51,000. Now we are still in the process of dating Mammoth Q to fit within that time frame. So we're not entirely sure approximately where he fits, but we do have that general time frame. Now if Mammoth Q did not die with the herd, how did he die? Well, I want us to look at how Mammoth Q is laying down. He is flat on his stomach with the legs splayed in opposite directions. That will tell us that Mammoth Q actually died very suddenly because mammoths, much like elephants, could not physically push themselves up from their stomach. They just did not have that musculature in place. So if Mammoth Q did die suddenly, what happened? What caused it? Now with a sudden death, that oftentimes is a complication with the flesh. And our Columbian mammoths, they don't get preserved with their flesh and their fur. But when we look at Mammoth Q's rib cage here, one of these ribs looks a little bit different. About halfway down this rib right here, there's a growth. That growth tells us that Mammoth Q broke that rib approximately a year before passing away. And this is a common injury we see in modern day elephant males after they get in fights during mating season. So two elephants will fight each other. Sometimes their tusks will break apart from each other and hit the opponent right in the rib cage. And we believe this is how Mammoth Q sustained that broken rib. We're not 100% certain if he won or lost that fight, but he did live. Now, if this injury did not kill him, why is it a clue? Well, when we look at the surface of this growth, we're going to see grooves along the growth. What those grooves tell us is that there was a bone infection as the rib was healing. So while Mammoth Q had a year to heal and get better, that infection had a year to fester and get worse, and it spread throughout his body. So whatever did end up killing Mammoth Q, we believe it was a result of that infection. Now those are our mammoths. Those are the main points from our mammoths. But we don't just have mammoths in our bone bed. If we look beyond our mammoths right over here, we also have a Western camel. And she's super cool. Now camels actually originated here in the Americas, even though I know when you think of a camel, you do not associate it with the state of Ohio. You can actually still see some of the camel's modern day descendants in the llamas and alpacas that we find throughout the Americas. Now when we look at our Western camel, the biggest thing I want to point out to you folks today is her spine, because that is the most visible evidence of scavenging that we can see from up here on the platform. Now with her spine, there's this pointed end right here that's pointing back towards us. That is her sacrum, or what we know as the tailbone. However, the sacrum should be sitting with the hips, right in the pelvic inlet. And when we look for her hips, they're located on the complete other side of her spine, right over here with her back legs. So this tells us after our camel died, something that ate meat walked through the area and saw the easiest rib dinner of its life. It took a bite of our camel's rib cage and spun her spine 180 degrees. After it got its fill, it left. And this let us know that we should start looking to see if meat eaters left anything behind. Now these could be scavenger species, maybe a vulture of some kind. These could be predatory species like a direwolf that would hunt for their meat. They could have been strictly carnivores, animals that only ate meat, or they might have been omnivores like us who eat meat and vegetation. So as we start looking around, we do find something that a meat eater left behind, but it is on a different level than our camel. When we look right above our camel, right over here, we actually have a tooth from a saber-toothed cat. And this is a juvenile canine tooth, so these sharp and pointy ones. But this does not mean a juvenile dropped out. For saber-toothed cats, their juvenile canine teeth would stay in place as the adult canine teeth grow in order to stabilize the growth. Once the adult canine tooth is finished growing, the juvenile tooth will fall out. Meaning that yes, it is possible that we had a saber-toothed kid who lost the tooth before it was ready, but it is also entirely possible it was time for that tooth to fall out. Until we find more of the skeleton, we will not be able to say with certainty which circumstance it was. And this isn't the only animal where we want to find more of the skeleton. When we look above our saber-toothed cat at this sign right here, we also have an even-toed mammal, or part of the Artiodactyla animals. Those animals include deer, elk, and moose. But the reason we cannot be more specific than that at this point in time is because all we have from this animal are these two ribs up here. Now, ribs aren't the best bone to use to determine species. They can tell you useful information like relative size and what kind of animal it is. That's what we've learned from these two ribs. But we can't tell more than that until we find more of the animal. Now, with our bone bed here, we have all of these different animals, and progress is somewhat slow. We only have one full-time paleontologist working with us year-round. The rest of our work is done by volunteers or part-time seasonal workers. But our research is very, very important because we shed a light on an aspect of mammoth behavior that hasn't been highlighted before. Remember, we had a nursery herd, the first ever nursery herd, and as it stands right now, the only nursery herd of Columbian mammoths to be discovered. The reason this is so important is because a lot of the mammoths that we see currently in the fossil record are adolescent males. Adolescent male mammoths get kicked out of nursery herds once they reach around 14 to 15 years of age because they start to get a little bit too rowdy to stay with the herd. It becomes a danger. Once they get kicked out, they don't have generational knowledge to warn them about situations a nursery herd might know to stay away from, such as tar pits or sinkholes. This leads to adolescent males being represented much more frequently in the fossil record. And a really great site that showcases this phenomenon is a site in Hot Springs, South Dakota. At the Hot Springs Mammoth site, they are our sister site. They have over 60 confirmed individual mammoths. Out of those 60 mammoths, they do not have one single female mammoth. And that's why our site's so important. So yes, our progress is somewhat slow. It is so important to this greater understanding. And once we understand how these animals live and maybe how they passed away, we can use all of that information to hopefully stop it from happening again to modern day species. Now that is going to conclude the 12:30 talk. So you've got 10 more minutes to look around, or if you want to stay until our 1 o'clock talk, you can do that too with our next ranger. But feel free to explore to your heart's content, and I will be here if we have any follow-up questions.
Thank you. Is the camel at the side?
ஸோ அவங்க எக்ஸ்பிளைன் பண்ணவங்களோட ஃபோட்டோ எடுத்தேன். அவங்க கை போட்டுக்கலாமான்னு கேட்டாங்க. எனக்கு ரொம்ப நல்லா சந்தோஷமாக இருந்தது. நம்ம ஓவரால் வியூ காட்டுறேன் பாருங்கள். ஸோ சுற்றி இதான். ஸோ கண்டுபிடிச்சிட்ருக்காங்க.
அமெரிக்காவில் நாங்கள் கண்டுபிடித்த ஒரு இடம் அப்படி சொல்லி போட்டுடலாமாங்க? This full thing is made out of rock.
டேஞ்சரஸாக இருக்குது. இது ரொம்ப டேஞ்சராக இருக்குது. இந்த காட்டு யானை வருது.
நீ என்ன போயிட்டு வரியா உள்ள?
நோ நோ, இட்ஸ் வெரி டேஞ்சரஸ் சைட்.
முள்ளுங்க.
ஆமாம்,
இந்த ஆதிக்கு நல்லா குத்தி இருக்குங்க.
ம்,
டவுசர் வேற போட்டிருக்கான்.
ம், வாங்க.
நீ வேணா போயிட்டு வர.
ஸோ வர வழியெல்லாம் அழகான ஃபோட்டோஸை கேப்சர் பண்ணி அழகாக ஸ்டாண்ட் வச்சு எக்ஸ்பிளைன் பண்ணியிருந்தாங்க. இந்த லீஃபு, இந்த வெரைட்டி ஆஃப் நேமு, அதோட கேரக்டர் எல்லாம் போட்டு சூப்பராக இருந்தது. ஸோ நாங்கள் இப்போ பார்த்துட்டு வீட்டுக்கு போயிட்டுருக்கோம். ஸோ வந்துட்டோம், ஆல்மோஸ்ட் முடிஞ்சிருச்சு. ஸோ ஆத்விக் அந்த கடையில் ஷாப்பிங் பண்ணிவிட்டு ஸோ ஃபைனலாக இந்த கடைக்கு திருப்பி வந்து ஆத்விக் ஒரு அழகான ஸ்டோன் வாங்கினா. அதோட விலை வந்து $13. ஸோ அவன் ஹாப்பியாக வாங்கிட்டு வீட்டுக்கு வந்துட்டான்.
கீ செயின் வைக்கிறியா? அதுக்கு இந்த ஸ்டோன் கீ செயின் இங்கே வா.
Oh, wow.
That like holographic aspect to it.
அந்த இதில் அந்த இதில் அந்த சூப்பர் அங்கே பாரு.
கடைசி வரைக்கும் என் வீடியோ பார்த்த எல்லாருக்கும் நன்றி. தேங்க்யூ ஸோ மச். பை பாய். லவ் யூ ஆல்.